All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Marshall W. Allworth Planetarium. My name is Jessica. I am the director and will be your tour guide to the night sky tonight. So for our show tonight, since it is the first Wednesday of the month, we are doing our Exploring the Monthly Sky. So we'll take a look at what stars, constellations, planets, and other things that you can find in the sky this month. Now, if at any time you need to leave during the show, you'll just exit through the same door you came in. Just, of course, be careful because it is going to get dark in here. If you need them, bathrooms are out down at the main entrance by the big telescope. And yeah, other than that, if you have any questions throughout the show, feel free to ask. We can't always see hands in the dark, so you're welcome to just ask the questions out loud. If you're not comfortable doing that, you can always come find us after the show and ask questions. All right, with that, I'm gonna head to the back and we'll get started. All right. So we are getting started with the sky set up for right now. Since we are still having some early sunsets, it is already pretty dark. But I'm going to go just a little bit further. I'm going to go just a little bit further into the night, not too much further, just so we can get to some good dark skies. Looks like I didn't have to go very far. Okay. So as I said, tonight we will be exploring all of the cool things that we can find up in the sky for the month of February. And we're going to get started looking here in the north. And there are 7 bright stars sitting kind of low in the northern sky this time of year. And that is, of course, our Big Dipper. Now, the Big Dipper itself is actually not a constellation. It's what we call an asterism. So it's a smaller, more recognizable group of stars that's part of a larger constellation. In this case, the Big Dipper is part of Ursa Major, the Big Bear. So for the entire bear, we have to add in some other stars there. And we have the handle of the Dipper is the tail of the bear. The Dipper itself is kind of the back half. And then those extra stars we added in make the head and legs. So let me just pop on some art here, make it a little bit easier to tell. That is our big bear in the sky. Now, since we have a Big Dipper and a Big Bear, it makes sense that we must also have a little version, a Little Dipper and a Little Bear. Now, the Little Dipper itself can be difficult to find. The trick is to use the 2 front stars in the cup of the Big Dipper. Those are our pointer stars because if we connect them in a line, they point us to this bright star here named Polaris. And Polaris, you may know it as the North Star. So that is your trick to finding the North Star. You find the Big Dipper, you take those front 2 stars in the cup, and you follow them over to Polaris. The other trick, if you're having trouble, is to look for the giant in the sky and go up. Now, the reason we found Polaris, our North Star, is because it is the end of the handle of the Little Dipper. So here is the Little Dipper. Again, we have 7 stars, just like with the Big Dipper. But depending on what your location is, you may only see 1, 2, or 3 of these stars because the stars are pretty dim. So you have to have super, super dark skies in order to see all 7 of them. And that means getting outside of the city, outside of light pollution. but you can generally at least see the North Star and the two stars at the front of the Little Dipper. Now, our Little Dipper is also our little bear. There's no extra stars here. The handle is the tail, and the cup is the body of the little bear. Now, these bears may look peculiar to you. If you've ever seen a bear, you may be surprised to see such long tails on these bears. And there is a story to explain that. It's not just that the Greeks had no idea what a bear looks like. This story involves Zeus, who's the king of the Greek gods. And one day, Zeus made a new friend with a woman named Callisto. And Zeus's wife Hera was jealous of their friendship, so she decided to turn Callisto into a bear. That meant that Callisto's son Arcus was left alone, and Zeus didn't want that. He couldn't turn Callisto back to human, so he did the next best thing. He turned Arcus into a bear. And he wanted to make sure that the two of them stayed safe and together forever, so he decided to put them up into the night sky. And so he picked them up by their stubby little bear tails, spun them around, and flung them into the night sky, where they now live together forever. And that is what stretched out those bear tails. So our big bear is the mama Callisto, and the little bear is her son Arcus. Now, near the bears, we have a couple of other things that are really cool to see if you have a pair of binoculars or a small telescope. So first up, right next to the tail of the big bear, we have what's known as the Pinwheel Galaxy. So this is a spiral galaxy, just like our own Milky Way. And it is a beautiful galaxy that, again, with just a pair of binoculars or a small telescope, you can see all for yourself. It's a great one to try and find there, right next to the tail of the big bear. On the other side of the tail, we have another galaxy. This one is the Whirlpool Galaxy. And this one has a little companion with it, a little smaller galaxy right next to it. Those two are actually in the process of merging together, which is why you can sometimes see there's like a stream of stars here connecting the two, because their gravity is slowly pulling the two galaxies together. So another really good telescope target. If you don't have a telescope, then I have another object that you could take a look at, and you can challenge your family and friends to see who has the best eyesight. If you take a look at the middle star in the handle of the Big Dipper, or the tail of the Big Bear, you can see a star there that at first glance may look like a single star, but it's not. There are actually two stars there. They're named Miser and Alcor. And so here we have the two stars. Whoops, I don't know why that one's acting all funny. It's dancing around for us. Now, you do not have to have a telescope or binoculars to see the two stars. You just have to have good vision. In fact, for many early cultures, this double star was used as either an eye test or a test of age, since as you get older, your eyesight tends to get worse. And so if you can distinguish that there are two individual stars there, then you've got some pretty good vision. Mine is not good, even with glasses. So I'm just trusting that you can actually see that without a telescope, because I definitely can't. All right, Well, I want to point out one more thing over here. It's more in the northwest, so let me turn us just a little bit. High up in the northwest, you can see a group of stars that looks kind of like a W, a sideways W, or a sideways M, depending on which way you want to look at it. To the Greeks, this was the Queen Cassiopeia. Now, it does take a little bit of imagination to turn a W into a queen, but generally she is pictured as if she's sitting in her throne, and we're getting kind of a view of that, of her sitting in her throne, which you can kind of see here. Now, the reason I'm pointing this constellation out is, well, two reasons. One, it's a really bright one that's easy to find, so it's a good kind of beginner constellation to look for. The other reason is it can help you find one of my favorite things to see in the night sky. If we take the bottom part of the W here, we can kind of turn that into an arrow. And if we follow that arrow, it's going to point us to this little fuzzy blob right there. And let me get a marker on it. There we go, that little fuzzy blob there. That is the Andromeda Galaxy. You do not have to have a telescope to see this one, unlike the first two that I showed you. This is the only galaxy that you can see with just your eye. No telescope needed. Now, if you do have one, you'll be able to see it in a bit more detail. And you can make out, depending on how big your telescope is, you'll be able to make out more details, maybe even see some of the spiral arms, because the Andromeda Galaxy is another spiral galaxy. But that is always one of my favorite things to point out, because usually when we talk about galaxies, most people assume that you can't see those easily, which is correct for most of them, but this one is one you can. Can you ask a little bit louder? So galaxies are separate from each other. So these aren't part of our galaxy. They are galaxies all of their own. You can kind of think of them as like little islands of stars and planets and other things that are all collected together. Yeah. All right. What I think we're going to do now is turn ourselves over to the east. Now, as we do, I should point out that Cassiopeia that we saw is situated right in the middle of this fuzzy band that arches across our sky. That is our galaxy that we're seeing. Most of the stars in our galaxy are too far away for us to see as nice little points of light. The stars that we see in our night sky are really just the closest couple thousand stars. So all of that light kind of blurs together to give us this haziness. Now, before we move on to some other stars and constellations, I figure we should take a look at what planets we can see. Let's turn ourselves a little bit more south. I should have stayed west actually earlier. Forgot they were setting pretty low now. Yeah, that band across the sky, that's us looking at our galaxy that we're inside of. Yeah. All right, so we have a few planets that are visible. If you get out just after sunset, you may still see Saturn peeking out over in the west, but it's getting pretty low, so it's much harder to see. But we do still have Jupiter, nice and bright, high in the sky, right when it gets dark. In fact, as the sun is setting and it's getting dark, Jupiter is probably going to be the first thing you see because it is brighter than all of the stars that it's around. So if you're looking kind of southwest, right as it's getting dark, and you see one really bright thing there, you're actually looking at the planet Jupiter. Now, of course, to just our eye, it looks as a point of light, but with a pair of binoculars or a telescope, we can see a lot more detail to the planets. You can make out the different colors, bands of clouds. And if it's pointing to us, which it's not right now, but if it's pointing towards us, you can also see the Great Red Spot, which is the giant hurricane on Jupiter. Now, on either side of Jupiter, we have two more planets, Uranus and Neptune. These are both, you have to have at least a pair of binoculars to be able to see them. They are too dim to see with just your eyes. And with binoculars or telescope, you will make out a small little kind of disc that is bluish in color. And that is the planets that you're seeing. All right. So I'm going to turn us a little bit back towards the southeast because the last few things that I want to point out to you are over here. This time of year, over in the kind of east-southeast, we have 6 very prominent constellations, which we call the winter hexagon. Now, you can trace out the winter hexagon by the brightest stars in each of the constellations. So we'll do that first, and then I'll tell you what constellations they're in. So for our winter hexagon, we're going to start over with the star Pollux, then go over to Procyon, Sirius, Rigel, Aldebaran, Capella, and over to Castor. Now, I know there are technically 7 stars, but Castor and Pollux are part of the same constellation, so we still call it a hexagon because there are 6 constellations. So this is our winter hexagon. So we're going to start our constellations of the winter hexagon with the one that most people are familiar with, and that is Orion the Hunter. He is very easily found by his 3 belt stars, surrounded by 4 stars that make kind of a rectangle. And so that is the 2 upper stars at the top of the rectangle are his shoulders. The 2 lower ones are his knees. And then, of course, we have his belt. And then he's either depicted as holding a shield and a club or a bow and arrows, just depending on which art you're looking at. So even though Rigel is the star in the winter hexagon, because it's the brightest star in Orion, I think the more interesting star is this shoulder star here named Betelgeuse. Now you may notice that it is red in color. That's real. It is a red supergiant. That means it's a massive star at the end of its life, and eventually it's going to go supernova, which means it's going to explode. Now, we are perfectly safe. We're far enough away. It's not going to hurt us. But we are close enough that when it does explode, it's going to be bright enough that we'll be able to see it even during the daytime. So personally, I'm hoping this happens sometime in my lifetime. We don't know for sure. It's going to be astronomically soon, which could be tomorrow, could be 5,000 years from now. We just don't really know. But that name, Betelgeuse, is actually Arabic. A lot of the bright star names are Arabic because Arabic astronomers adopted the Greek constellations. And the Greeks didn't give names to the brightest stars, so they did. And the names they gave them were pretty literal. So Betelgeuse, when you translate it, means the armpit of the hunter, because that's what it is. One other thing in Orion that I want to point out is just below his belt. You can see what looks like 3 stars hanging off of his belt, and that usually is called the sword of Orion. But that middle star, you will notice, is actually a little fuzzy. That's because it's not a star. That is the Orion Nebula. Now, a nebula is a giant gas cloud in space. And in the case of the Orion Nebula, which it should be brighter than that, I'm going to talk about it while I make it brighter. In the case of the Orion Nebula, this is what we call a star-forming region. So it is a massive gas cloud where new stars and solar systems are being built. There we go. That looks a lot better. And these star-forming regions tend to be the largest structures that we find in our galaxy. And this is another thing that you can see with just your eye. You just got to look for that little fuzzy blob hanging out there just below Orion's belt. All right, let's move on to the rest of the winter hexagon. We're going to move to Sirius. Now, if the star wasn't already labeled for you, which, sometimes the night sky isn't that convenient for us and doesn't come with labels, the trick to finding the star Sirius is to use Orion's belt. And so we just follow that belt downward, and it would point us to the star Sirius. Now, Sirius is the brightest star in the night sky, and it's part of Canis Major, the big dog. Sirius is generally portrayed as the the jewel on the dog's collar. There you can see him. He's a little bit sideways, but we have his head there, right here, and then his body and some legs coming off. And then Sirius is, as I said, the jewel on his collar. So since Sirius is part of the dog constellation, the big dog, it's often nicknamed the dog star. And that is where the phrase, the dog days of summer, come from. I don't know if anyone has heard of that phrase, but the early Greeks knew that as soon as Sirius started being visible just before sunrise, they were heading into the warmest days of the year, the hottest days of the year. And so that became kind of like the days of the dog, or the dog days of summer. And that's where that phrase comes from. It was also a really important star to the early Egyptians. For similar reasons, they knew when they started seeing it in the night sky just before sunrise that they were getting to the time of year when the Nile would flood, which was, of course, very important to their agriculture. And so for same reason, the star was also important to them, and they actually associated it with one of their goddesses, Isis. And so that was the goddess Isis. And she was kind of forewarning the flooding of the Nile. All right. Now, this is the big dog, which does mean we also have a little dog, and that is what our star Procyon is in. I'm going to just put up the constellation lines for the little dog, and I want to see what you think. So here we go. Yeah, it's 2 stars. It's Procyon and the one above it. That's the little dog. Sometimes you really got to have some imagination to see these constellation pictures. I guess it's a wiener dog. A lot of astronomers and planetarians will joke that that's actually the stick that Orion is throwing for the other dog constellation. But one of my favorite things And let me see if I can find it real quick because I keep forgetting to add it to this panel. But one of my favorite things when you have a system that will show you kind of the outlines of the constellations is right there in between our big dog and little dog is a very, very faint constellation. Oh, not that one, this one. A very, very faint constellation here, right in between the two. And it may be hard to tell what that is. So let me turn on the art here. That is a unicorn. And so in the maps of the night sky, it looks like the little dog is riding into battle on the unicorn. And I love it. It is so funny. So yeah, there you go. If you feel bad for the little dog, don't, because he's riding a unicorn. And that immediately makes him very cool. All right. Let's go back the other direction now. Starting at Orion and following his belt upward is how we would get to the star Aldebaran. And let me turn that name off real quick because it's a little bit hard to see that what we're actually looking here is kind of a V of stars in the night sky. That V is the head of Taurus the bull. And the star Aldebaran is the kind of angry red eye of the bull. So we have his kind of snout and his horns. His body stretches out this way, and then we have a couple of legs. It's kind of like he's charging down Orion, which was always interesting to me because the Greeks don't have any stories about Orion and Taurus. They're not in any stories together. So it always confused me why we see them what looks like in battle in the night sky. And it turns out that's because these constellations were adapted from the Babylonians and the Sumerians, who did actually see these two constellations as a man and a bull that were fighting. And so the Greeks kind of adopted the constellations and put their own stories to them, but that's why in the sky, those constellations we see are still kind of in battle because of the initial origins of those constellations. And I thought that was pretty cool. We're going to see a similar type thing with our next constellation. But before we do that, if we actually travel into the body of Taurus, you will notice what looks like a little mini dipper. And a lot of people do mistake this for the Little Dipper. This is actually the Pleiades star cluster, or you may know it as the Seven Sisters. It's called that because in dark skies with your eye, you can generally see 6 or 7 bright stars, depending on how good your eyesight is. But it turns out there are about 10 times that many stars in this star cluster. Star cluster is just a group of stars. And so this is another one that I really like to encourage people to try and find in the night sky because it is really bright, meaning you can see it even in a city. It will outshine even really bad light pollution. So it's a great one to go out and try and find for yourself. All right, we are almost done. We have 2 last constellations. Our penultimate, what's the right use of that word, right? Yeah, penultimate constellation, I always get confused with that word, is the constellation that our star Capella is in. And that is a part of Auriga the Charioteer, or Auriga the Chariot Driver. This is another one that does take some imagination. One of the ways that he's often depicted is that this is him sitting in the chariot, and he's often seen kind of holding the reins of the chariot, but the constellation itself is him. You'll also notice, though, that a lot of art shows him holding a goat, which is what we see here. And that was another thing that confused me, because nowhere in his story or his, constellation do we hear anything about a goat? But this is another case of this constellation being adapted from the Babylonians and Sumerians, because for them, the star Capella was a goat. And so when the Greeks adopted this constellation, they kind of kept that star being associated with a goat. And so they show Auriga holding a goat, which is that star there. I don't think I've told you any of these, Rachel, yet. This is some new stuff that I've like recently found out in the past like month or so. All right, our very last constellation here is with our stars Castor and Pollux. They are part of Gemini, the twins. Castor there has a long body and short little legs, where Pollux has a short body and long legs. And so there we can see the twins together in the night sky. And that completes our winter hexagon. We have Orion, Taurus, Auriga, the Gemini twins, the little dog, being totally awesome riding a unicorn, and the big dog. And that is our winter constellations, our winter hexagon. All right, we are at the end of our time, so I'm going to fast forward time here, get us a little bit further into the night. As we do, we'll see our winter constellations are starting to head over to the west, and over in the east, we are seeing our spring constellations rise. And we will start talking about those in probably another month or two. So if you're interested, you can always come back for, it's probably going to be the April, exploring April sky is when we'll start the spring constellations. But as we keep going through the night, we've got our spring constellations, as I said, and just before the sun comes up in the wee early hours of the morning, we also are starting to see some summer constellations. So if you're really eager for summer, you can just go out at 5 a.m. and there's your summer sky. And just before the sun comes up, we've got a couple of planets making an appearance. We've got Venus, which is going to be the really bright thing you see in the east right at sunrise. And then a little bit harder to see behind it is Mars. And Mercury is going to be even harder to see right now. But as we get towards the end of the month, Mercury and Mars will be further and further out from the sun, so they'll be easier to see in the early morning sky. All right, that brings us to the end of our show. I'm going to turn the lights up. Before you head out, if you haven't already, there are star charts sitting out on the table in front of the TV at the main entrance. Feel free to grab one of those, help you find the stars and constellations we talked about here tonight. There are also planets labeled on there, so it's a really good tool to kind of help you as you navigate the night sky. Are there any questions? Yes. It is. Don't worry, as soon as you walk out the door, time will reset. So you don't have to worry about that. So the color of a star is determined by its temperature. So if there's slightly different colors of red, and I don't know their temperatures off the top of my head, but it's very likely because they are slightly different temperatures. So they're going to be slightly different shades of red. Yeah. All right, well, thank you all. If you have any other questions, feel free to come up and ask. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming, and have a safe trip home and a wonderful rest of your week.